Hi there. I'm Randy Patterson, a psychologist in clinical practice, and this is Psychology Salon, a channel about psychological issues. If you like this kind of thing, click subscribe. This is the fourth in a series of videos on the process of grief, and we're using some of the insights suggested by William Worden in his great book, Grief Counselling and Grief Therapy. Worden talks about 4 tasks of grief, and we've discussed the first 2 in other videos: accepting the reality of the loss and experiencing the pain of grief. In this video, the 3rd task: to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing. But honestly, there is something I didn't mention in the last video on experiencing the emotions of grief. The whole point of this series is to help people normalize some of their experience and to reduce that sense that you're just doing it wrong, or that what's happening means you're crazy, or that the loss has revealed just how defective you really are. Because those are common thoughts, and they stand in the road of grief like a barrier. As much as anything, it's these ideas that get the process stuck. I mentioned the sensation of frustrated longing, and I talked briefly about anger. But there's an emotion that may be even more taboo, even more difficult for some people to deal with. And it's one that they often don't feel they can share with anyone else. In therapy, it tends to come up late in the process, not because it wasn't there earlier, but because someone really needs to trust us to talk about it. So what is this terrible emotion? Relief. Now, keep in mind that this is a video. It is a general observation. Nothing I say applies to everyone, and everything that does apply works in a slightly different way. For some people, relief is a complete nothing. It's not there, never was. For others, it seemed like it wasn't, and then they realized later on that it was. And for still others, they felt it from the beginning and held it as their darkest secret. The easiest kind of relief is when someone was in terrible pain or discomfort, and the loss at least means that their suffering is over. But it's harder to acknowledge relief that we might experience on our own behalf. I don't have to go to that hospital anymore. I don't have to try to convince them to stop using drugs anymore. I don't have to wonder when that next shoe is going to drop, the next heart attack, the next stroke. I don't have to stay home all the time because we never got enough palliative care. I can go back to work. I can see my friends again. I can live my life again. How disloyal. How normal. This feeling of relief doesn't have to be the dominant one. Even a whisper of it is enough for some people to torture themselves. I'm secretly glad all of this happened. What kind of monster am I? As I keep repeating in this series, a big part of the mission is to open ourselves to acceptance of what happened and of our reactions to it, letting what is be what is. And part of it is acknowledging reality. Maybe it is a relief not to have to deal with some aspects of this person. Maybe it is a relief not to make an illness the focus of your life, in part. If relief is all there is, it usually isn't a problem. It's when it gets tangled up in all the other emotions of loss and longing that it feels impossible. If relief is a problem, it's not a sign that someone didn't care. It's a sign that they did. Okay. So the third task of grief is to adjust to an environment in which the deceased person is missing. This is not the job early on. There's no rush to this one. But early in grief, we're looking relentlessly back at what we've lost, at that world that has our lost person in it. And we're wishing that we could get there. When we're working on this third task, we're shifting our gaze to the new world we find ourselves in, the world without that person. And here, we're looking at the holes that they've left behind. That person was in our life. What roles did they play? In creating this kind of symbiotic relationship with them, this dance, what were their steps? Much of this is quite practical. When a spouse dies, for example, obviously there is a lot of emotional impact. And what is the practical impact? Maybe they earned the money. Maybe they knew where everything was. Maybe they took charge of the kids. Maybe the garden. Maybe the cooking. Maybe the family finances. Maybe the driving. Maybe they were the person who listened to you, the person you went to the movies with, the person you played music for, the traveling companion, the person who empathized when you had a problem or helped you solve it. Maybe their challenges or their hockey passion or their schoolwork occupied a lot of your time so that you always had something to do. In addition to the emotional impact of the loss or the separation, what are the practical elements of life that they either handled or were a part of? And that's whether you liked it or not. Frankly, you hated getting dragged to every football game or every opera, but now you're not doing that, and there's a gap in your life. Maybe you hated their stewardship of the finances, but at least they did them, and now you're faced with a task that you have no preparation for. The person's passing may itself have put some practical tasks on the table. There's all kinds of medical equipment you no longer need. Or the death of a parent may mean that a home has to be emptied and sold. Or being an executor might mean a whole series of legal tasks. In therapy for grief, we'll often focus on the intense emotional consequences of what's happened. But eventually, bit by bit, we may need to shift our attention to some of those practical concerns. There's a drip in the basement, and somehow it needs to be addressed. It's tax time, and things will only get stickier if you don't make a filing. The care home needs the bed, so we need to collect all of Mom's things. You haven't driven the car in 20 years, and now there's nobody to drive it for you, so maybe you need a refresher. So we don't switch gears entirely. Right, it's time we stopped sniffling and got to work. Not at all. But gently, we might need to start working on some structural changes in a person's life. At this point, one of the emotions that people experience is feeling overwhelmed. The clock is ticking and all of this stuff needs to get done. If we begin working on it, that rising tide of panic or feeling of impending doom can begin to abate. The temptation is to withdraw inward, pull up the drawbridge, hunker down, hide out. Listen, I was barely managing before all of this. Now I am overwhelmed by grief. How can I possibly take on all this stuff? I'm just going to hide and watch YouTube. But obviously that's not going to help. That just lets the problems get even worse. I alluded in the last video to the idea of grief coming in waves. And gradually, those waves get a little bit further apart. As the gap between waves expands, even slightly, we can begin doing some of what needs to get done. And that can help the process continue. We've still lost that person, but now we're not at risk of losing ourselves too. We've been wondering if there's light at the end of the tunnel. There hasn't been. But if we begin moving forward, that light can begin to appear. There are other videos on this channel on the psychology of everyday life. Click the subscribe button for more. I also have an online course site, psychologysalon.teachable.com, with programs for professionals and for the general public. And my guide, The Assertiveness Workbook, is available from bookstores and online booksellers. Thanks for watching.